The uniform was never meant to be found there. It hung crookedly from a rusted nail, swaying slightly in a breeze that shouldn't have existed inside an abandoned restroom. White fabric, once pressed and pristine, now stained with grime and time. The sleeves were twisted as if someone had wrung them in anger. The name tag was still attached, but barely readable beneath layers of dirt. And this wasn't just any uniform. It belonged to a pilot who had vanished 8 months earlier, moments before boarding a flight that never took off. But in 1990, no one knew that yet. Back then, the disappearance wasn't a mystery. It was barely even a concern. At least, not at first. But before we continue, if you enjoy deep, slow-burn true crime stories like this one, take a moment to support the channel. Make sure you subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our next story. Now let's begin. On the morning of March 18, 1990, the terminal at Redwood Regional Airport was already humming with its usual pre-spring rhythm. Families hurried through security. Business travelers checked watches. The smell of burnt coffee drifted through the concourse as flight announcements echoed off the tiled walls. Flight 372 was scheduled for a routine domestic route. Nothing remarkable, nothing risky. A short hop. 2 pilots assigned. Both experienced. Both trusted. Captain Daniel Mercer, a white American man in his early 40s, had been flying commercially for nearly 2 decades. Known for his calm demeanor and methodical approach, Mercer was the kind of pilot airlines loved. Predictable, disciplined, invisible in the best way. His co-pilot, Coleman, a black African-American man in his mid-30s, was newer to the captain's seat but equally respected. Former military aviation, sharp instincts, and a spotless record. Among colleagues, he was known for asking the kinds of questions that prevented accidents. That morning, the 2 men arrived separately, but both on time. Security cameras later confirmed it. Both wore white pilot uniforms, freshly pressed. Both passed through the employee entrance. Both exchanged brief words with ground staff. And then, somewhere between the crew lounge and the gate, they vanished. No distress call. No luggage left behind. No witnesses who could say what happened next. At 9:40 a.m., boarding began. At 9:55, the flight attendant assigned to Flight 372 noticed something strange. The pilots weren't in the cockpit. At first, it was treated as a delay. Maybe they were caught in security. Maybe one of them had been pulled aside for paperwork. Maybe they were in the restroom. Announcements were made. Ground control was contacted. The airline attempted to page both men over the intercom. No response. By 10:20 a.m., concern began to ripple through the gate area. By 10:45, Flight 372 was officially canceled. By noon, airport security was involved. And by nightfall, the phrase, "missing pilots," had entered the internal incident reports, though still, no one was panicking. Because people don't just disappear from an airport. Not like that. Initial searches focused on the terminal itself. Every restroom. Every maintenance corridor. Every employee-only hallway. Security footage was pulled and reviewed frame by frame. The last confirmed sighting of Captain Mercer showed him entering a staff-only corridor near the eastern wing. Coleman appeared on camera just minutes later, following the same path. Neither man was seen exiting. That corridor led to 3 places: a maintenance stairwell, an emergency exit, and a locked service door that required staff clearance. All were searched. Nothing. No struggle. No blood. No dropped belongings. It was as if the airport had swallowed them whole. Within 48 hours, The airline notified federal authorities. The FBI joined the case. Search dogs were brought in, but the scent trails ended abruptly near the same corridor. No alarms had been triggered. No unauthorized exits had been used. No vehicles were recorded leaving suspiciously. Theories began to surface. Had they planned this? Had one convinced the other to leave? Was there a personal motive no one knew about? But those who knew Mercer and Coleman rejected that idea immediately. These were men with families, reputations, careers that required stability and discipline. They had clocked in. They had dressed for duty. And they had walked toward their aircraft. Days passed. Then weeks. The media picked up the story, but interest faded quickly. Without evidence of foul play, without a ransom note, without a body, the case stalled. Both men were officially classified as missing persons. Families waited. Wives checked phones late into the night. Parents replayed old voicemails just to hear familiar voices. Investigators continued to search, but quietly now, with shrinking budgets and growing doubt. And then, as months passed, a darker possibility crept into the case. What if someone else had been involved? Because one detail refused to make sense. The security footage. That corridor, the last place both men were seen, had a camera malfunction during a precise 7-minute window. 7 minutes. Long enough for 2 men to disappear. Too convenient to be accidental. But no one could prove it. 8 months later, winter had begun to loosen its grip. And the search teams, reduced, underfunded, and desperate for any lead, expanded their efforts beyond the airport. Abandoned buildings near the perimeter. Old service structures. Decommissioned rest stops along nearby access roads. Places no one had checked before. Places no one expected to matter. Until one cold afternoon, when a volunteer searcher pushed open the door to a long-forgotten restroom near an abandoned service road. The hinges screamed. The air was stale. Graffiti covered the walls. And there, hanging inside a broken stall, was a white pilot's uniform. Dirty. Roughly turned. As if it had been removed in a hurry. The name tag was still attached. But before anyone could read it, the search leader called for everyone to step back. Because suddenly, the disappearance of 2 pilots was no longer a missing persons case. It was something else entirely. The uniform was lifted from the stall with gloved hands. No one said anything at first. The abandoned restroom sat less than 3 miles from the airport perimeter, hidden behind overgrown brush and a cracked access road that no longer appeared on most maps. It wasn't a place travelers stopped. It wasn't a place anyone should have been in 1990. Yet here it was. A white pilot's uniform, hanging deliberately, not dropped, not tossed, but displayed. Investigators immediately noticed something unsettling. The fabric wasn't just dirty from age or neglect. It was ground in grime, the kind that suggested the uniform had been dragged, twisted, and handled roughly. One sleeve was turned inside out. The collar was bent unnaturally, as if someone had grabbed it hard and yanked. And most disturbing of all, there was no blood. That should have been a relief. Instead, it raised new questions. Because if violence had occurred, someone had taken great care to erase it. The uniform was sealed and rushed to a forensic lab. Within hours, the families of Daniel Mercer and Isaiah Coleman were notified. But investigators didn't tell them everything. Not yet. Because the uniform presented a problem. No one could immediately confirm which pilot it belonged to. The name tag was partially obscured by dirt and corrosion. The serial stitching inside the collar, normally a quick identifier, had been cut out. That was not accidental. Someone had removed identifying marks, which meant one thing: the uniform had been altered after the disappearance. As forensic teams worked, detectives returned to the airport with fresh eyes. 8 months had passed, but the case had changed. Now this wasn't about two men who wandered off. This was about someone who wanted to be remembered. Because leaving the uniform wasn't careless. It was intentional. Security footage from the airport was reviewed again, this time with specialists brought in to reconstruct the corrupted 7-minute gap. They didn't recover images, but they did find something else. A manual override had been triggered on the camera system. Not a glitch. Not a malfunction. A deliberate interruption. Only someone with internal access could have done it. Someone who knew the system. Someone who knew when the pilots would pass through that corridor. Attention turned inward. Airport staff. Maintenance crews. Contractors. Anyone who had clearance, and a reason. Dozens were interviewed. Most had alibis. Some had weak ones. A few had no explanation at all. But no single name stood out. And that's when investigators realized something chilling. Whoever was responsible hadn't acted impulsively. They had planned this carefully enough to leave no trail. Back at the forensic lab, the uniform began revealing subtle clues. Microscopic fibers embedded in the fabric didn't match the restroom environment. They matched industrial insulation, the kind used in service tunnels, maintenance crawlspaces, restricted airport infrastructure, places the public never sees, places where cameras are rare. Places where two men could disappear without a sound. But there was something missing from the uniform. Something that should have been there. The wings. Every pilot wore them. A small metallic badge, pinned over the chest, marking their rank and certification. They were ceremonial, but pilots never removed them casually. They were a point of pride. Yet the pinholes were empty. Removed cleanly, as if someone wanted the uniform to be recognizable, but incomplete. A message without words. Investigators began asking a darker question. What if the uniform wasn't left to mark a crime? What if it was left to taunt them? Because whoever staged it wanted to be noticed, but not caught. And that kind of person doesn't disappear after one act. They watch. They wait. They enjoy the confusion. Meanwhile, families began noticing changes in the investigation. Detectives grew quieter. Questions became more specific. Certain details were withheld. When Isaiah Coleman's wife asked whether the uniform belonged to her husband, the answer was careful. "We're still confirming." But she noticed something else. In the photos she was shown, the uniform sleeves were shortened. Isaiah always tailored his sleeves. Daniel Mercer never did. That detail wasn't in any report. But it haunted her. As pressure mounted, search teams expanded again, this time underground. Service tunnels beneath the airport. Sealed maintenance passages. Old storage rooms forgotten after renovations. And in one tunnel, closed since the late 1980s, searchers found something that made them stop cold. A scuff mark. White paint transferred onto concrete. The same shade used on pilot uniforms. And nearby, a single shoe print. Not fresh, but preserved in dust. The size matched one of the missing men. And it was pointed away from the airport, which meant something terrifying. They hadn't vanished into the airport. They had been taken out of it. But how? And by whom? Because if someone could move 2 adult pilots through restricted areas, disable cameras, strip a uniform, and leave no trace for 8 months. Then that person knew the airport better than anyone investigating it. The tunnel was never meant to be opened again. It had been sealed years earlier, after a minor renovation rendered it obsolete. Officially, it didn't exist anymore. It wasn't on current blueprints. It wasn't included in emergency maps. Most airport employees working in 1990 didn't even know it was there. But someone did. Because behind a corroded maintenance door, forced open with tools that left precise, practiced marks, search teams found signs that chilled every investigator present. Not remains. Not yet. But evidence of containment. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The air was stale, thick with dust and old insulation fibers. Along the concrete wall ran a series of scrape marks, irregular but deliberate, as if something heavy had been dragged through in stages. At several points, the marks stopped, as if whoever was moving had needed to rest or listen. And then there was the smell. Not decay, not chemicals, but something organic, long gone, yet unmistakable. Human presence. Roughly 40 yards in, investigators found a recessed maintenance alcove. Inside it lay objects arranged with disturbing care. A pilot's wing badge, a cracked wristwatch, and a folded piece of fabric, white, frayed, unmistakably aviation issued. Not the uniform found in the restroom. Another one. This one torn. The watch was identified first. It belonged to Daniel Mercer. It had stopped at 9:18 a.m., 22 minutes before boarding was scheduled, 17 minutes before the camera blackout. The time aligned too perfectly to ignore. Mercer had been alive when he entered the corridor. And something had happened almost immediately after. The wing badge was harder. Its serial number had been filed down. But microscopic tool markings suggested the same instrument had been used to remove the stitching from the uniform found 8 months later. One person. One set of hands. One method. At this point, the investigation quietly shifted. This was no longer about where the pilots went. It was about why someone wanted them gone, and why the truth had been hidden so carefully. Profiles were built, not of suspects, but of a planner. Someone patient. Someone familiar with aviation routines. Someone who understood how pilots moved, where cameras failed, which spaces were forgotten. Someone who could approach 2 pilots in uniform without raising alarm. Someone who belonged. Investigators revisited personnel records from the late 1980s. One name appeared repeatedly, not as a suspect, but as a constant presence. A facilities systems specialist. Cleared for tunnels. Cleared for camera maintenance. Cleared for restricted corridors. Never accused. Never charged. Never publicly named. Because there was no direct evidence tying him to the disappearance. Only proximity, knowledge, opportunity, and silence. But then came the final, most haunting discovery. Deep in the tunnel, beyond the alcove, beyond where any official work would ever be done, search teams found 2 markings scratched into the concrete wall. They weren't random. They were deliberate. 2 vertical lines. One taller. One shorter. Side by side. As if someone had stood there, waiting. Forensic psychologists would later suggest a disturbing possibility. That the pilots were held for a time. Not killed immediately. Not released, but contained, moved, separated, and eventually erased. Why no remains were ever found remains unanswered. Some believe they were transported out through service routes never logged. Others believe the tunnels connected to decommissioned waste systems long since destroyed. And some believe something far worse. That the disappearance wasn't meant to end in 1990. That it was meant to stay unfinished. The uniform in the abandoned restroom was the only thing meant to resurface. A reminder. A signal. Proof that someone could take two men in plain sight and leave behind only what they chose to be found. Today, the case remains officially unsolved. No arrests. No charges. No closure. The families still wait. And the airport still operates, passengers walking unknowingly over sealed tunnels where answers may still lie buried. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it so these stories don't disappear the way these men did. Leave a comment below. Do you believe this was an inside job, or something even more calculated? Because sometimes, the most chilling mysteries aren't about what was discovered, but about what was deliberately left behind. They disappeared before a 1990 flight. 8 months later, a uniform was found hanging. And to this day, no one has ever explained why.